You may know Samson as the strongest man in the Bible, but his story is more than just feats of power and a woman named Delilah. It began with a miracle, announced by an angel, born to a barren woman, chosen by God before birth. It rose with unmatched strength, fiery battles, and a divine calling to deliver Israel. And it unraveled in moments of passion, pride, and painful betrayal. This is not just a story of strength, it's a story of purpose, failure, redemption, and the God who never abandoned him. This is the complete story of Samson and Delilah, and it will change how you see them forever. If this powerful story moves you, please like this video, leave a comment, subscribe for more biblical narratives, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's dive in. Before Samson ever tore apart a lion, before his name became synonymous with brute strength and tragic love, his story began in the quiet shadows of despair, not in a battlefield, but in a barren home. In those days, Israel was groaning under the oppressive weight of the Philistines. The people of God had once again fallen into cycles of rebellion, idolatry, and defeat. Their enemies ruled over them with arrogance and cruelty, mocking the covenant people who had forgotten their God. The cries of the nation were rising, but heaven's answer began not with an army, but with a womb. In the tribal land of Dan lived Manoah, a man of sincerity and faith, and his unnamed wife, a woman whose name history never recorded, but whose obedience would birth one of the most extraordinary figures in all of Scripture. They were righteous, they were faithful, but they were also childless. Month after month, year after year, they waited, prayed, wept, and watched other families grow. Barrenness in ancient Israel was more than pain, it was shame. A life without legacy, a name that would end, a heart that would not hear a child's laughter. And yet God often chooses the barren places to plant the seeds of his greatest miracles. One ordinary day, without warning or thunder, an angel of the Lord appeared to the woman. Not a vision, not a dream, but a being radiant with holy fire. He stood before her, shining with divine authority, and his words cut through her years of silence. Behold, you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. But this was more than a promise of motherhood. It was a calling, a sacred trust. The child would be a Nazirite from the womb, a lifelong servant of God, set apart by vows that others only kept temporarily. His very body would be a symbol of consecration. No wine would touch his lips, no unclean thing defile him, and his hair would never be cut, for in those locks was the mark of divine purpose. For the child shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. These were not just words of comfort to a barren woman. These were the first flickers of redemption for a nation enslaved. The strongest man in the Bible was not the product of military lineage or royal blood, but the fruit of a miracle, born to a woman the world had forgotten. Shaken and overwhelmed, she ran to tell Manoah. Her voice trembled with awe. A man of God came to me. His appearance was like the angel of God, very awesome. Manoah, stunned, fell to his knees in prayer. O Lord, let the man of God whom you sent come again to us and teach us what we are to do with the child who will be born. And God heard. The angel returned. This time Manoah met the messenger himself. With reverence he asked, "What is to be the rule for the child? What is his mission?" The angel repeated the instructions. Every detail mattered, for this was not just any child. This was a divine instrument, and the womb was his first sanctuary. Then, in an act of worship, Manoah offered a young goat upon a rock to the Lord. And as the flame rose from the altar, the angel ascended in the fire, disappearing into heaven before their eyes. They fell on their faces, terrified. "We have seen God," Manoah said. But his wife, with faith born in awe, replied, "If the Lord meant to kill us, he would not have accepted our offering or shown us all these things." And so, the prophecy unfolded. In due time, the woman gave birth to a son. They named him Samson, meaning like the sun, a blazing hope in a time of darkness. His arrival was not merely a personal joy. It was a divine intervention written into the very fabric of Israel's destiny. And as the boy grew, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him, not in quiet or subtle ways, but in power, in intensity, in moments of divine unrest. He was different, physically, spiritually, temperamentally. There was a fire in him, a strength the world had not yet seen. He was born to burn, to fight, to stand alone, to shake nations. He was born to wield strength that would confound kings and collapse temples. But this strength was never meant to serve himself. It was a gift from God, to be wielded in obedience. His hair, his vow, his calling, it all pointed to the one who gave him strength. And so, the story of Samson and Delilah, of triumph and downfall, of miracles and mistakes, began not with battle, but with a miracle, in the arms of a woman who once believed she would never hold a child. Samson's life was a paradox from the very beginning, a man divinely chosen, yet drawn by dangerous desires. He was a Nazirite by divine command, set apart from birth as a holy weapon of God. But within him raged a passion for what was forbidden. And in this tension, his journey as the strongest man in the Bible truly began. One of his earliest and most defining decisions revealed this inner war. As a young man, Samson went down to Timnah, a Philistine city nestled in enemy territory. There, amidst the foreign culture and idolatrous people, his eyes locked onto a woman, a Philistine, beautiful and captivating. She stirred something in him. Her appearance, her presence, it consumed his thoughts. When he returned home, he made a bold and unsettling demand to his parents. "I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now get her for me as a wife." His parents were stunned, distressed. "Is there no woman among your people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife?" they pleaded. Their question wasn't only about culture or ethnicity, it was about covenant. The Philistines were enemies of God, worshippers of false gods. To join himself to one of them in marriage felt like betrayal. But Samson was unmoved. "She is right in my eyes," he replied. Those words echoed the spiritual condition of all Israel in that era. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Samson, though chosen, reflected the brokenness of his people. A man set apart for God, yet led by what pleased him. And yet, God was not absent from this flawed decision. Scripture says that his parents did not know that this was from the Lord, not that God endorsed Samson's desire, but that he would use it as a spark to ignite conflict with the Philistines, who had ruled over Israel for 40 years. This moment marked the first time Samson would challenge the enemy, not through battle, but through a union doomed to collapse. As he traveled again toward Timnah with his parents to arrange the marriage, something unexpected and symbolic happened. A young lion leapt out at him near the vineyards. Roaring, teeth bared, claws flashing, it was a moment of sudden danger. But as it attacked, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson mightily. Without a weapon, without hesitation, he grabbed the beast and tore it apart with his bare hands, ripping it limb from limb as easily as tearing cloth. This was not just raw strength. This was divine empowerment, a supernatural force flowing through a human vessel. It was the first recorded display of the might that would define Samson's legend. But he told no one, not his parents, not the people of Timnah. He kept the miracle to himself, burying it like a seed of secrecy. Days later, returning for the wedding, he was curious. He turned aside to look at the carcass of the lion he had slain, and what he saw was deeply strange and symbolic. A swarm of bees had nested in the lion's remains, and they had made honey inside its bones. Samson reached into the corpse, scooped out the honey with his bare hands and ate it. The sweetness dripped from death. He even shared it with his parents, but again, told no one where it came from. And here, quietly and subtly, we see the first crack in Samson's sacred calling. As a Nazirite, he was not to come near anything dead. The vow was not just a ritual, it was a sign of holy separation, a life untouched by death or corruption. Yet here he was, reaching into the rotting body of a lion, tasting what should never have been touched. Yes, the honey was sweet, but the source was unclean. Samson's strength had already begun to mix with compromise. In the lion's death and the hidden honey, there was a strange parable of his life. A man who could kill lions but could not tame his appetite. A man who brought sweetness from strength, but often at the cost of his sanctity. And so he pressed on toward a marriage that God would use for divine confrontation, but that Samson pursued out of human passion. He was strong, yes, incredibly strong. But this part of the story reminds us that true strength is not just the power to destroy your enemies. It is the wisdom to govern your heart. Samson's journey had begun. His muscles would shake nations, but his soul would wrestle with desire, pride, and compromise. This marriage to a Philistine woman would not last, but it would begin a domino effect that would set fire to the Philistine world and expose the tragic flaw in the strongest man who ever lived. The wedding feast in Timnah should have been a celebration of union, but instead, it became a battleground of pride, deception, and foreshadowed pain. For Samson, the strongest man in the Bible, this moment was not just about marriage. It was his first true collision with the Philistine world, a world he was meant to challenge, not marry into. Following the custom of the time, Samson was given 30 Philistine companions to be his wedding guests. But they were not his friends. These men were not there to rejoice with him. They were there to watch him, to judge him, and ultimately to represent a culture that was hostile to his God and his people. Samson was a stranger among them, even as he joined himself to one of their daughters. And Samson, confident and clever, decided to test them. He would not fight them with his fists, not yet, but with his wit. "Let me now put forth a riddle to you," he said at the feast, his eyes burning with challenge. "If you can solve it within the 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot, then you shall give me the same." The riddle he offered came from a secret, deeply personal moment, his encounter with the lion and the sweetness found in its corpse. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. It was poetic, mysterious, but also untouchable, because only Samson knew the truth behind it. No one else had witnessed the lion's death. No one knew of the honey hidden in the carcass. The riddle was a shield for his secret, a way to win a bet and establish superiority over the Philistine men around him. For 3 days the companions wrestled with the riddle. They argued, speculated, and grew increasingly agitated. The words teased them like a lock without a key. Their pride turned to frustration, and by the 4th day, desperation boiled over into threats. They went to Samson's bride, their countrywoman, and delivered an ultimatum laced with terror. "Entice your husband to explain the riddle to you, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Did you invite us here to make fools of us?" What began as a game now turned into something deadly. The men were willing to destroy the bride to preserve their own pride. Terrified, caught between her own people and her new husband, the woman turned to the only thing she could weaponize: tears. Day after day she begged Samson to tell her the answer. Her voice quivered, her eyes pleaded. She wept before him, accusing him of not loving her, of withholding his heart. And though Samson was strong enough to tear apart a lion, he was not strong enough to resist her sorrow. This would not be the last time a woman's persistence would undo him. Finally, worn down by her constant pressure, Samson gave in. He revealed the secret. The riddle was about the lion and the honey. With the answer in hand, she ran to the Philistines. On the 7th day, before the sun set on the wedding week, the men approached Samson with smug grins and hollow charm. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" At once, Samson knew. The answer wasn't just in their words, it was in their tone, in their timing, in their eyes. He knew that only one person could have betrayed the riddle's secret. His heart tightened, his jaw clenched. Betrayal had entered his marriage before it even began. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he growled through gritted teeth, "you would not have solved my riddle." It was a biting proverb, crude and angry, his way of saying, "You didn't win by wisdom. You cheated. You used her." But Samson was not a man to walk away humiliated. Rage coursed through him, white-hot and holy. The Spirit of God had stirred him to deliver Israel, but now it stirred him through personal betrayal. He went down to Ashkelon, a Philistine city miles away, and struck down 30 men, stripped their garments, and brought them back as payment for the wager. The message was clear. "You may think you outwitted me, but I am not a man to be mocked." Yet the victory was not satisfying. His heart had been pierced. His pride had been wounded. His marriage had been tainted. So Samson walked away, burning with anger and confusion. He returned home, leaving his bride behind at the very threshold of their new life. But the insult was not over. While he was gone, the Philistines gave his wife to another man, his own companion, someone he had trusted. The betrayal deepened. His wife, his riddle, his honor, all stolen by the very people he had tried to embrace. This event, this wedding turned war, would ignite the flames of personal vengeance. And though Samson's strength would soon be unleashed like a storm, it was this moment of heartbreak and humiliation that set the fire burning, because the man who could crush armies was being undone by betrayals from within. When Samson returned to Timnah, it was not just the return of a husband, it was the return of a man whose soul had been betrayed and mocked. He had come to see his wife, to perhaps mend the rift left by the wedding feud, but instead of reunion, he found a final insult waiting like a dagger. She had been given to another man, and not just anyone, to his own companion, the very man who had stood beside him during the wedding. A friend turned thief, a bride handed away, a vow desecrated. For Samson, a man not used to defeat, a man born under angelic prophecy, who had faced lions and armies with unflinching strength, this betrayal cut deeper than any sword. It was not merely a personal wound, it was an assault on his identity, his honor, his calling. The fire in his heart needed release, and he would unleash it not on men, but on what they treasured most, the fruit of their labor, the pride of their economy, the provision of their gods. So Samson, consumed by righteous fury, devised an act of judgment both brilliant and brutal. He captured 300 foxes, wild, elusive, biting creatures, and tied them together in pairs. To each pair, he fastened a burning torch between their tails, turning the foxes into living instruments of wildfire. And then he set them loose, not into battlefields, but into the lifeblood of Philistine agriculture. Grain fields, vineyards, olive groves. Everything the Philistines grew, harvested, and depended on was suddenly engulfed in flames. The fire spread like prophecy, leaping across dry stalks, climbing into trees, devouring vines heavy with grapes. This was no ordinary act of revenge. This was symbolic warfare. The land they ruled over Israel with was now burning at the hands of one man. The Philistines were not only enraged, they were humiliated. A single Israelite, acting alone, had turned their prosperity into ash. But instead of confronting Samson directly, they did what they often did. They retaliated in cowardice. They went to the woman, Samson's bride, the same woman they had once threatened during the riddle ordeal, and to her father, and they burned them alive. The very threat they had once used to force her betrayal they now fulfilled in their vengeance. Innocent or not, they wanted to send a message. No one who touches the pride of the Philistines escapes unpunished. When word of the horror reached Samson, something shifted inside him. Grief twisted into fury, a sorrow too deep for tears, a wrath too heavy for restraint. The fire he had sent through their fields now blazed in his heart. This was no longer about garments, riddles, or even marriage. This was war. Samson rose, and with the strength of divine calling and personal devastation, he struck the Philistines with a great slaughter. The ground was stained with judgment. Bodies fell like sheaves of wheat. No army stood with him. He was the army. One man, one purpose, one holy fire burning through his soul. And when his vengeance was spent, he withdrew, not in fear, but in weariness. He retreated to the cleft of the rock at Etam, a solitary place carved into the earth, like a scar that matched his own. There he sat, Israel's fiercest judge, wounded, alone, and burning with a justice that would not be quenched. He had been chosen to begin the deliverance of Israel, and deliverance had indeed begun, but not through peace or diplomacy, through fire, through strength, through wrath. And yet, deep within this storm of judgment, a pattern was beginning to form. A man whose strength was constantly awakened by betrayal, whose calling was often blurred by pain, and whose enemies underestimated not just his power, but the God who had called him. This was no ordinary warrior. This was Samson, Israel's fiercest judge, a man of might and mercy, a judge whose fists were forged in heartbreak. But the Philistines would not rest. Though they had seen fire sweep through their fields and felt the sting of Samson's wrath in their bloodied streets, they were determined to break him. They could not allow one man, one Israelite, to humiliate them without consequence. So they marched. An army of Philistines rose up and invaded the territory of Judah, Israel's own land. But their swords weren't raised against armies. They came for Samson. Their presence struck terror into the people of Judah. These were not distant rulers anymore. They were at the gates. And instead of rising up in defiance, the men of Judah cowered beneath the weight of fear. 3,000 of them, a staggering number, went not to confront the Philistines, but to confront Samson. When they found him in the cleft of the rock at Etam, they came with trembling voices and desperate pleas. "Don't you realize the Philistines rule over us?" they said, as if he had forgotten. "What have you done to us?" Samson, still blazing with the fire of God's judgment, but worn from the weight of isolation, replied, "I only did to them what they did to me." It was justice, not rebellion. But to a people long broken under oppression, even justice looked like danger. So they made a request that would have broken lesser men. "Let us bind you. Let us hand you over." Samson could have crushed them. He could have turned his strength on his own people in righteous rage. But instead, he did something surprising. He surrendered. "Swear to me that you yourselves will not kill me," he said. He would not harm his own people, even when they lacked the courage to stand with him. And so they bound him with new ropes, strong and tight, and led him like a prisoner to the Philistine camp. But the Philistines were not prepared for what would happen next. As Samson was brought before them, bound, seemingly conquered, they shouted in triumph, believing their enemy had finally been subdued. But their victory dance was premature. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson again, like a thunderclap in his bones, and in a moment, the ropes snapped like charred straw, falling from his arms as if they had never held him. His eyes scanned the battlefield, no sword, no spear. But there, lying in the dust, was the fresh jawbone of a donkey, an instrument of death, discarded and unworthy by human standards. But in the hands of God's chosen, even a jawbone becomes a weapon of divine judgment. Samson seized it. And then he roared into the Philistines like a storm. 1 by 1, 10 by 10, 100 by 100, he struck down 1,000 men. The battlefield trembled beneath his feet. His arms, fueled by divine might and righteous fury, did not tire. Sweat poured from his face. His breath came in flames. Blood stained the ground as the army that once laughed at him crumbled in heaps of their own pride. No one had ever seen such a sight. One man, one crude weapon, one unstoppable judgment. And when it was over, Samson stood amidst the carnage, alone, not with glory in his eyes, but exhaustion. He dropped the jawbone. The battlefield, once full of mocking voices, was now filled only with silence and the groans of the dying. And in that silence a cry rose, not from the earth, but from Samson's soul. "Lord, you've granted this great victory through your servant, but now, shall I die of thirst? Will I fall into the hands of the uncircumcised after all this?" It was a rare moment of vulnerability. The mighty warrior, thirsty, human, weary. Even warriors have limits. Even champions need their God. And God answered. He opened a hollow place in the ground, and water burst forth, clear, cool, life-giving. Samson drank deeply, and his spirit revived. Not just his body, but his calling was renewed. And he named the place En-Hakkore, meaning spring, the spring of the one who cried out. This wasn't just about survival, it was a reminder. His strength was never truly his own. Every victory, every rescue, every impossible feat was God's strength moving through him. The jawbone wasn't the source, neither were his arms. It was the Spirit of the Lord. From that moment on, Samson judged Israel for 20 years, carrying the weight of being a lone deliverer in a time of spiritual darkness. He had no army, no throne, no prophet beside him. He was one man with a vow, divine strength, and a fierce fire that never stopped burning. But behind every blow he struck was a deeper truth. Even the strongest man needs God's water. Even the mightiest warrior can thirst. And even Samson, hero of muscle and might, was only strong because the Lord was with him. As the years passed, Samson's legend grew. Tales of his strength echoed through the cities of Israel and into the dark palaces of Philistia. He had struck down armies, toppled fields, burned harvests, and humiliated kings. He was a terror to his enemies and a mystery to his own people. But despite his victories, Samson's greatest weakness was never steel. It was affection. Time and again, he had been drawn to foreign women, and his passions often walked ahead of his wisdom. And now, as the sun of his story reached its zenith, his heart was captured once more, this time by a woman named Delilah. She lived in the valley of Sorek, a region nestled between Israelite and Philistine lands, a fitting symbol for the woman who would walk between two worlds, Samson's love and Philistia's hatred. Delilah was stunning, elegant, disarming, but her beauty was as dangerous as a dagger hidden beneath silk. She didn't need chains or spears. She had charm, voice, and eyes that could unravel a man from the inside out. And the Philistine rulers, cunning and patient, saw an opportunity. If Samson could not be conquered in battle, he could be conquered in bed. They came to Delilah with an irresistible offer, a fortune in silver. Each of the 5 lords of the Philistines promised payment if she could extract the secret of Samson's strength. They weren't interested in love, they wanted a weapon disarmed, a warrior broken. And so the seduction began, not with violence, but with whispers. Night after night, Delilah played her part. She wrapped herself around him with affection, speaking soft words, asking with apparent innocence, "Tell me, Samson, what makes you so strong? Where does your power come from? How could someone bind you and make you weak?" It was a question laced with poison. Samson, aware on some level of the danger, responded with games, clever lies wrapped in riddles of their own. "If I'm bound with 7 fresh bowstrings, I'll be as weak as any man. If I'm tied with new ropes never used before, I'll lose my strength. If you weave the 7 locks of my hair into a loom." And each time Delilah followed through, playing the fool in love while testing his claims. And each time she cried, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And each time, he snapped the cords, shattered the ropes, or tore away the loom like a god among men. His strength remained, but his discernment was wearing thin. Still, Delilah was relentless. She wanted more than games. She wanted the truth, and she would not rest until she had it. Day after day, she pressed him. Her words became weapons. Her affection became manipulation. Her embrace became a trap. She wore him down, not with force, but with persistence. "If you truly loved me, you would tell me. Why do you keep mocking me? You say you love me, but how can I trust you?" And at last, the unthinkable happened. The strongest man in Israel, a man who had torn lions, slain armies, carried gates, was defeated by sorrowful eyes and insistent words. He told her everything. "I am a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb," he said, his voice no longer defiant but tired. "My hair has never been cut. It is the sign of my vow. If my head is shaved, I will lose my strength and become like any other man." It was not just hair, it was a covenant, a holy bond that tied him to the God who had chosen him before birth. But in that moment, Samson placed the secret of his strength into the hands of a woman who served his enemies. And Delilah knew. Her eyes did not widen in wonder, they narrowed in calculation. She had won. She sent word to the Philistine lords, "Come now, this time he has told me everything." And they came, silver in hand and murder in their eye. That night, Samson lay sleeping in her lap, at peace while danger hovered inches above. As he slept, a man was brought in to shave off the 7 locks of his hair, the symbol of his calling, the mark of his divine empowerment. The blades cut silently through destiny. Lock after lock fell to the floor, and heaven remained silent. Samson stirred, and Delilah whispered again, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." He rose, heart beating with confidence, thinking strength would rush through him like it always had. But this time, nothing. No strength, no power. He did not know that the Lord had left him. It's one of the most tragic lines in all of Scripture. The man once filled with divine strength was now just a shadow. Not because of hair, but because his heart had been slowly handed away. His strength had never come from muscle but from the Spirit of God. And now, with the vow broken, the Spirit withdrawn, and the enemy at the door, Samson stood defenseless. It wasn't the Philistine army that defeated him. It was compromise, seduction, betrayal, and a trust placed in someone who was never worthy of it. This was the moment his enemies had waited for. But even they didn't realize what they had truly stolen. They had not just captured a man, they had silenced a judge. The one who had begun Israel's deliverance was now shackled in enemy hands. All because love became a snare, and a vow became a whisper. The strongest man in the Bible, Samson, the terror of Philistia, the judge of Israel, The Nazarite, anointed from birth, was now a captive. Once feared, he was now fettered. Once celebrated, now shamed. The mighty had fallen. They seized him, laughing with cruel satisfaction, and as if to seal his humiliation, they gouged out his eyes. The man who once saw lions before they leapt, who beheld beauty in battle, who was led too often by what he saw, was now left blind. It was more than punishment. It was a message, a declaration. Your strength is gone. Your vision is taken. Your God has abandoned you. The Philistines led him to Gaza, the very place where once he had shattered their gates and carried them away in the night. Now those same streets bore the shuffle of Samson, broken and enslaved, a public trophy of their triumph. They chained him in bronze shackles and assigned him the task of grinding grain, a slave's labor, a work reserved for beasts of burden. The man who had slain thousands with the jawbone of a donkey now walked in slow circles, pushing the millstone, sweating in darkness, forgotten by the world and seemingly by heaven. And yet, in that darkness something stirred. His hair, shorn by betrayal, began to grow again, slowly, quietly, without fanfare. Each strand a symbol, each curl a whisper that God was not finished. It was not just hair, it was hope. It was the sign of his vow beginning to return. Though blind, though fallen, though mocked, God was still writing Samson's story. And so he waited. He listened. He prayed in silence. Until one day the moment arrived. The Philistines announced a grand celebration in honor of their god Dagon, a festival soaked in pride and mockery. Thousands gathered in the great temple, lords, nobles, officials, and citizens. A sea of enemies rejoicing in Samson's defeat. Bring him out, they laughed. Let him entertain us. They summoned the once mighty judge, now blinded, shuffling, scarred. He was led by the hand of a young boy, unaware that he was guiding destiny into place. The temple was massive, upheld by two central pillars. As the crowd jeered, Samson leaned close to the servant boy and whispered, "Place my hands on the pillars that support the structure, so I can rest against them." And as the noise of the crowd swelled, and the name of Dagon echoed through the halls, Samson bowed his head. He didn't rely on himself, he turned to God. He prayed, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, that I may avenge my eyes on the Philistines." This was not the same Samson who once toyed with riddles or gave in to seduction. This was a broken man, a humbled judge, a warrior who finally understood that his strength was never his own. He braced himself against the two pillars, one hand on the right, one hand on the left, and then, with all the might the Lord granted him in that final moment, Samson pushed. The pillars groaned, the walls cracked, the temple trembled, the ground beneath the Philistine rulers shook. Panic erupted, screams filled the air, and then, collapse, stone upon stone, wood upon head, dust and screams. The temple of Dagon crumbled to the earth, burying Samson and thousands of Philistines beneath its ruin, and in his death, he killed more of his enemies than he had in his life. The man once enslaved had become the weapon of final judgment. The blind man had become the hand of justice. The broken man had become the deliverer Israel needed. His final act was not one of revenge, but of redemption. Samson's fire had returned, not just to his limbs, but to his spirit. And though the price was his life, his death thundered louder than all his victories combined. Later, his family came, quietly, reverently. They recovered his body from the rubble and took him home. They buried him in the tomb of Manoah, his father, between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol. He was gone, his strength broken, his vow shattered, his body buried. But his story, it remained etched in blood, stone, and covenant. Samson's life ended where many thought his strength would never fail. Between two pillars, arms stretched, eyes blind, and voice lifted in one final prayer. He was a man who had once been feared, envied, and admired. A man who had once believed his strength was his own. But in the end, as stone cracked and crowds screamed, it wasn't his muscles that mattered, it was his surrender. Because the Samson we remember most is not the man who carried gates or slew lions, but the man who, blinded and broken, called on God one last time. And in that final act, He became something greater than a judge. He became a vessel of redemption. This story is not only about power, it is about purpose. It is not just about failure. It is about the God who can still move through the wreckage of our worst decisions. Even in his darkest hour, Samson was not forsaken. His hair began to grow, quietly, unnoticed. But with each strand something sacred stirred, and the Spirit of the Lord returned, not to glorify a man, but to fulfill a divine plan. Let Samson's story remind us that strength without obedience leads to ruin. But weakness, when surrendered to God, can become the most powerful testimony of all. Maybe you've failed. Maybe you've strayed from your vow. Maybe you've simply lost your way. But the God who restored Samson is still writing stories like his today. If this story has touched you, moved you, or reminded you of God's grace in your own life, I invite you to respond. Please like this video to help others discover it. Comment below what part of Samson's journey spoke to you most. Subscribe to the channel for more biblical storytelling like this. And most of all, share this video with someone who needs to know that even the strongest fall, but God can still raise them. Thank you for walking with me through the miracles, mistakes, and mercy that shaped Samson's story. Until next time, stay strong in your faith, stay humble in your strength, and never forget, the God who gave Samson strength still writes through the broken and brave.